Awesome.
Oh, that's good. Boys down one end, girls at the other. Excellent.
Oh, yeah.
Great start.
We didn't plan that.
Great start. No, I reckon we did.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about ownership, language, structure and sharing for a creative new economy. And we've got a really diverse panel here. So we're sort of going to start the discussion with language and we're kind of going to do a bit of a journey. So we've got Ghil'ad. Peter first. So Peter Chigau, an actor and an activist. If you speak very nicely to him, he might show you his recent KFC commercial. He's the founder of Social Enterprise Services and the chair of the Mercury Cooperative, who is sponsoring this event. He's also was one of the founders of the Adelaide Fringe Festival, which really was one of the first disruptive co-created events, which kind of makes him, I think, one of Australia's most knowledgeable members of the cooperative community. Okay, next we have Professor Ghil'ad Zuckerman. He's a professor of linguistics, currently working at the University of Adelaide. He's currently working in reclaiming the Bangala, did I say that right? Bangala Aboriginal language and investigating the link between language revival and mental health. Very interesting stuff. So if anyone can talk about the power of language and the use and abuse of words, it's going to be Ghil'ad. Okay, next up we have Josh Vial. Josh is a programmer, entrepreneur, educator and founder of Enspiral. Now, if you haven't heard of Enspiral yet, you're kind of in for a treat, and I don't really want to say too much because I'd rather Josh explain it. But to me, it kind of takes co-working, co-funding and collaboration to this completely new level. So I'm quite excited to hear him talk about that. And then we've got Dr. Natalia Nikalova. Hope I said that right. She's a senior lecturer at UTS Business School and at the UTS Faculty of Transdisciplinary Innovation. She's currently undertaking research on how to foster innovation in large established organisations on shared leadership, and I'd say better business leadership, and the management of creative industry organisations. And sitting next to me, we have Jess Scully. I'm not sure if she needs much of an introduction, but she is a curator, thinker and City of Sydney councillor who's currently working with UNSW Art and Design on the GLAM Alliance. But she is, of course, the founder of the Vivid Ideas Festival, so without her, we wouldn't be here. So, yeah. No problems. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the sharing economy, and I thought I would just start with the most traditional definition I could find, which was from the Oxford Dictionary. So the sharing economy is defined by them as an economic system in which assets and services are shared between private individuals for free or for a fee, typically by means of the internet. And we're going to debate whether that is kind of the right definition or not. But before we kind of get into talking about whether the term has been hijacked, I just wanted to ask everybody if you remember the moment where you first heard the term sharing economy and did it capture your imagination? What did you kind of think about it? Anyone? Jess?
Hi. Well, maybe the first time I really heard it take off was maybe would have been about 8 or 9 years ago when Rachel Botsman was getting a lot of attention talking about the sharing. Was it the collaborative economy or the... really, she was talking about the idea that we could share assets and resources in a more thoughtful way, rather than everyone having one of everything. We could have items in some kind of communal store, or that we could use technology and platforms to better share resources. So I think that's when I first really heard the term.
Natalia?
I probably heard it first in relation to enterprises, businesses. So when I think about it, Linux will be probably the first well-known example, but I don't think we were speaking about the sharing economy back then because it was a one-off. But when we started having Wikipedia and then we had the emergence of Uber and Airbnb, I think this is when the term sharing economy started to take off.
Josh?
I think I first heard about it with WeShare in France and with Shareable, the publisher. So it was people who were more commenting on the emergence of the sharing economy when the phrase really crossed my radar. And lots of the principles and ideas I'd seen in different shapes before, but that was when I heard about the sharing economy, was the growing number of commentators on it.
Yeah, Ghil'ad?
I'm not a native speaker of English. The first time I heard sharing economy was when Peter Tregilgis showed me the McDonald's. So for me, sharing economy is actually McDonald's. This is how I associate sharing economy with McDonald's.
And Peter?
I first heard it several years ago. I worked for Regional Development Australia in the Mid-North Coast in Port Macquarie, and we ran a strategic regional leadership conference. And in 2012, it was the International Year of Cooperatives, and we ran the national conference for them in Port Macquarie. And it was at that time we had a visitor from the Mondragal group from Spain, one of the biggest cooperatives in the world, and he was talking about this movement that was occurring in Europe. And so 2012.
Yeah. So on that, so it does have a certain kind of ring to it. So Ghil'ad, my question for you is, like, what is the power of having a term like sharing associated with business or an industry?
Well, I think that what we see in this beautiful and telling, intriguing photo that Peter shared with us is not only obfuscation, which means kind of making the McDonald's activities unclear, but also appropriation. And this is why it is much more powerful than just obfuscation. I would argue that you see here prostitution, as Peter kindly reminded us, but also substitution. And I would like to explain a little bit how it happens. I'll give you an example for my own country, which is Israel. I was born in Israel, and the place where the parliament used to be and is still is called Mishkan. Now, Mishkan in the Bible is the place where you work God. It's where you put the Torah, the Torah, the 10 Commandments. But here in Israel, in Jerusalem, Mishkan turned to refer to the place where you work not God, but the country. It's the parliament building. So again, it's not only obfuscation, it's also appropriation. You substitute God with the state. And the same here, what McDonald's does. And this is the power of language, la puissance du verbe, we call it in French. It is taking this sharing term, which is obviously very positive and beautiful and has connotations that are good for well-being, and hijacking it for its own agenda. So the substitution here is very powerful because it's not only making it unclear, it makes clear that a person like me who sees sharing economy for the first time with McDonald's would actually associate sharing economy with McDonald's. And this is the power. And I was kind of half joking when I answered the other question that you asked, but this is exactly what happens with many people. So this is the power. You kind of take a term which is already established and you use it as a shortcut to a beautiful overtone and a beautiful baggage for your own agenda. This is called hijacking. This is called the obfuscation and the appropriation of terms. And this is exactly what happens here, and it happens every day in the political arena.
If I might just add this, another really good example of how businesses are appropriating terms for their own purposes is the term business ethics, which has been used for businesses to justify their practices while still pursuing very one-dimensional profit maximization goals with disregard of other stakeholders in the environment. So the same thing when you talk about business ethics, it's not. It doesn't really cover what it's meant to be around moral responsibility, taking a personal responsibility towards what you as part of businesses and corporations are contributing, or what kind of harm you might be causing through your one-dimensional focus on one goal only. But it's been appropriated to say, oh, no, we are ethical, we're doing the right thing. So, and it's the same thing in the business schools. So business schools are using the term business ethics to say we're doing the right thing, we are educating the future managers and leaders properly. But in fact, it's been misused, and it's not really leading to practices that are improving the future and improving our organizations and our well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest criticisms that I've had, and I did an experiment in the sharing economy a couple of years ago, and for me, when people were sharing assets, underutilised assets, it seemed to work quite well. But when you were sharing services like your time, it didn't seem to work quite well. And we've seen this with Uber, that it's not really sharing, it's kind of could be exploitation. Especially, we've also got platforms like TaskRabbit that takes 30% of what workers kind of earn. But I guess what I wanted to ask is there a better solution that has more to do with sharing that workers can get involved in? And I think this is definitely a question for you, Josh.
Yeah, I think that when I think about the sharing economy, one of the reasons why it picked up was because a lot of people have got a disenfranchisement with business in general. That we can see a lot of good things that business has done, but we can also see a lot of harmful things that have been caused by the way our financial system works. And I think a lot of that is around the exclusion of business, that it's not an even playing field that anyone can participate in. There are lots of barriers which are intentionally in there to stop people participating in the financial system. And I think that this is the same reason why social enterprise picked up as a word. And I think both of them have had the same challenges of lots of people get excited about it. Oh, here, it's kind of business-like, but it's also kind of good and sharing and social, and we like that, and we want to see a more ethical, moral business for everyone, which I think a lot of people feel a yearning for. And that's sort of why these things crop up and people start to get excited by them. And then you'll see the mainstream sort of financial system start to go, oh, yeah, Uber's sharing economy. Actually is Walmart social enterprise. Like it's those kind of, no, Walmart's a social enterprise, but it's you do see this blurring edge where businesses which are pretty traditionally structured will start to talk about themselves as a social enterprise and having a social mission. So I think that one of the long-standing movements that have been focusing on democratizing the financial ecosystem is the cooperative movement. And it sort of grew up at about the same time the labour movement did. And this is the sort of 1800s when you have horrific employment conditions, deep exploitation of people by wealthy, powerful folks, unsafe practices, unethical practices, and a deep people using their power for their own benefit. Lots of people suffering, a few people getting ahead. And the two big responses to that, or two of the big responses, was the labour movement and unions and people forming solidarity and saying we are going to use industrial action and collective bargaining to get our voices heard and to get a fair pay and fair working conditions for us. And the other one was the cooperative movement, which said we're not going to negotiate for a better deal, we're going to structure our own businesses which are owned by the people who need those businesses. And those were sort of two responses. So I think that the cooperative movement, it's got a lot of history and a lot of actual legislation behind it and track records. It's much harder to co-opt than a new word like social enterprise or sharing economy is.
Yeah, very interesting. Anyone else have any comments on that?
There's also another example of a country where there's been a legislative change in order to accommodate some of these aspects that Josh was talking about, and that's the introduction of Mitbestimmung, which is co-determination in Germany. So in Germany, organizations that are larger, I think, than 20 people have an advisory board, similar to here, but in the advisory board, there's a workforce representation. And so all major strategic decisions that are made by the company, they have to be made by involving the employers as well. So that co-determination model is actually one of the big successes of the German economy and German economic model. Many people say it's actually one of the reasons why Germany is such an successful economic power with regard to keeping the Mittelstand, so the mid-sized organizations, successful despite globalization pressures.
Fantastic. So we've also seen, like, we're in an environment now where a lot more people are working freelance, and I think one of the, like, co-working has been, put under the definition of sharing economy for a while, but there's not really that much sharing going on if it's just someone who owns some space and, rents out desks. But you've got a bit of a different structure at Enspiral, Josh. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I describe Enspiral as fundamentally a cooperative of entrepreneurs. It's about 30, 40 people who their business is building businesses, and instead of doing that alone or in an accelerator program or just with their core co-founders and investors, they're trying to do it together, more collectively. We've been doing that for about 7 years, and we started out as a collective of freelancers. So mostly programmers, but we were freelancers who would be selling our time to clients, and then we wanted to work together to do that more effectively. And I've seen lots of case studies and examples, and we've met a lot of people around the world who are doing these collective of freelancer type of arrangements. So instead of running your own freelancing firm and figuring out your taxes and your branding and your sales process and your lead generation and all of that, they meet with other people and say, hey, I'll give you some leads, you give me some leads, maybe we have a shared brand, maybe we invest in some shared resources and infrastructure and some shared overheads, and maybe we can have a better experience of freelancing. Because I think that it's fascinating when you say the gig economy is like having a bad boyfriend, and it can be that, but also freelancing can be being your own boss, working your own terms, being able to choose the way you earn a living with much more power. And I think a lot of it comes down to what is the bargaining power on each side. If you're on TaskRabbit and if you don't get to set the terms and if you get barred from the system and you don't have a job anymore, then that's very different from if you're running your own consultancy firm and you have a good bargaining position with your clients and a long-term relationship there. So I think that they're quite different things, but one of the main thing is that they're using technology to change the nature of work. And I think one of the main ideas is that, like it or not, the technology that's been emerging is going to deeply transform what it means to work and earn a living over the next 10, 20, 50 years.
Peter?
This is it's interesting. We would have then cut immediately to one of the Michelle Baldwin's little pieces, which you'll now be able to see on the website. But Michelle talks of exactly this scenario in the worker environment. And in particular, he focuses on commons and the transition. But in particular, he's referring to that labour market scenario, which is highly relevant for creatives and the arts. And he's working for an organisation in Belgium called SMART, which has a process of where they aggregate their and contribute to the organisation.
It's 2% of their income.
Yeah, about 3% of their income, which then pays for and plus some other bits and pieces of fees in a cooperative scenario. But it creates an environment of where the artists can actually have an ongoing engagement and employment within that cooperative mechanism. And which means that they're protected in that sense with a labour market, and so it creates the barrier between between being the freelancer and always never knowing where the next quid's coming from and whether you'll be paid in 60 days, 90 days, or whatever. And then actually, so creating a consistency, which means you can do things like buy a house or potentially pay the rent.
Although you can't buy a house in Sydney, let's be honest.
I think Josh made some really interesting points about this idea of almost like an epochal sort of moment where you start to have a shift in the power dynamics. And that's what I think is happening right now. But I also think that there are some serious market distortions going on that are changing the way that we think about collaborative platforms, or suggesting some platforms, are working or some approaches are working. I mean, we talk about Uber all the time, and I mean, if we had $1 for every time someone mentioned, Uber owns no cars, Airbnb owns no hotel rooms, all the rest of it, but Uber's also losing something to the tune of $700 million a year, and every trip that you or I take using UberX is subsidised to the tune of about 40% of the cost of that trip. So these are not fair markets, and these are not workable models for the long term. But what they do suggest is that there is a different way of organising power. There's a different way of organising labour. But we need to approach it with, I think, the same sort of solidarity and a different sort of mindset to the one that we currently have. So we've got the technology and we've got the tools, and we've got the market there. But what we need is, I think, a different sort of mindset as to how we work together. And that idea that creatives might be able to collaborate, freelancers might be able to collaborate and share back office, I think is really important, because at the moment we don't have that bargaining power, we don't have that back end. If you're a creative, I've been a freelancer for 15 years or so, and I probably spend 40% of my time doing admin, which is a terrible use of time. And so if there was a way to aggregate that back end. And you know, there have been great examples of this. There's the Freelancers Union in the US, for example, which has looked at getting things like healthcare and superannuation or 401ks, it's what they have there, to help individuals have the same sorts of back end that businesses do.
Yeah. Sure.
I would like to just make two comments on, firstly, about what Jess has just said, admin and bureaucracy, and then about something that Josh said that I thought was very important. I believe Australia is neither a democracy nor an aristocracy. It was born ab initio, I'm talking about modern Australia, as a bureaucracy. And we live in a bureaucracy run by bureaucrats, and also professionalized Americanization caused us to be even more bureaucratic than ab initio, than the very beginning. So it will take some time to get out of this admin that you're within. Now, this kind of is related to something that Josh said. And this is the revolution, the technological revolution. We are currently under the technological revolution. Some people call it the digital age. Talk because, you know, it has to do with talking, I mean, online. And I believe that just as the industrial revolution of 1760, 1840 turned people from seeking food to seeking things, it was a huge revolution when it comes to what you seek in life, because most of your ancestors were farmers. 90% of your ancestors were farmers. After the Industrial Revolution, 4% of your ancestors are farmers. The technological revolution that we are part of, all of us, will turn people eventually, and I'm talking about the hoi polloi, I'm not talking about the elite. The elite, of course, is already there. The hoi polloi, the masses, from seeking things to seeking ideas. When this happens, when people, the hoi polloi, seek ideas, that will give the sharing economy in the old kind of real sense a boost, because people will look for new ideas to do such things and not just to be like sheep, like in America, you know, like consumer sheep. So I think it's very important to put what we are talking about in a historical perspective. Industrial revolution turned people from seeking food to seeking things. What we are currently experiencing will turn us from seeking things to seeking new ideas.
I certainly hope so. I want to get back to cooperatives for a minute, because we sort of touched on that and I want to talk about that a little bit more. So cooperatives were really big in the 70s, but it sort of seems that the idea of them have kind of died out in recent times. This is kind of a question for Peter and Nicola. Natalia, why do you think this is?
Where do we start? I mean, firstly, I think that one of the issues around cooperatives, and have they died out? They haven't. They've been consistent. Through the 60s and 70s, there was a period of demutualisation. One of the things about cooperatives in particular is that their structure is a conservative structure, particularly financially. And one of the things about cooperatives is longevity, and that they really do remain in the environment, having created stability amongst their membership. And so one of the aspects of that is that they grow and grow a capital base, and it's important that they do that because that creates that stability for the organisation. This is particularly evident for, say, credit unions, the financial components of it, as well as it is for some of the trading bodies. But what's important to that is that when there have been periods when, of course, I'll use the term loosely, but the carpetbaggers try and raid that, and particularly in the 60s and 70s, to try to get that cash and then demutualise the scenario. And it happens several times. My favourite example is probably West Farmers, of course, and everyone will know that that's Bunnings. And originally this was a group that was set up in the 30s in Western Australia as essentially farmers groups. But one of the things about cooperatives that's got to be remembered, and what's really important, is that cooperatives make a number of different categories. There are producer cooperatives, which are farmers who come together. There are buying cooperatives, which in other words about getting a better price for your scenario. But there's housing cooperatives as well, about how you provide that. And there's two different sorts. One is the distributive cooperative, who is about making money and improving that scenario, and the other is about the not-for-profit scenario. But all of those, and what's important, particularly about the distributive, is about a market. They're actually selling or trying to have control and manage a market. So one of the issues that's occurred over recent times has been that understanding of what the market is, particularly around the values-based trading groups, say as the incorporated associations, the basic not-for-profits. So that may not quite answer the question, but put some perspective into it.
Natalia, what about your students? Is anyone at the business school, do they think about starting cooperatives or?
Yeah, look, unfortunately, not many people talk about cooperatives at all, or no. I don't think there's much teaching on cooperatives. I've actually done a quick research on academic publications on cooperatives, and there's not much there. I think there are a couple of things that are kind of explaining why, despite the significance of cooperatives, people are not aware very much about cooperatives as an alternative business model or as an alternative organizational form, and why we don't hear much about cooperatives in the media either. Firstly, I think it's from the 60s and 70s, then we followed in the 80s, and then we had the big rise of the neoliberal thinking and the neoliberal agenda, obviously pushed by Reagan and by Thatcher. And with this, we had that big movement of privatizing everything and talking down everything that was not privatized, that's not governed by the market. So the market became the leading force. The market became our new god and still is. So everything that's not governed by the market is inefficient and is questioned. Why? To the extent that we have become a society that are completely governed by that model. And there's some of you might know the book What Money Can't Buy by Michael Sandel, who is a professor in law from Harvard University. It's an absolutely amazing example, and he is one of the most well-known living philosophers today, and he discusses that issue of our societies turning into societies governed by money. So this is one of that's the rise and spreading of neoliberalism is one reason why we cooperatives have actually become non-existent in a way in the eyes of media and the eyes of people. So that's one example. That's one reason. And the other reason, I think, is just that in a way, media doesn't seem to find it interesting to write about cooperatives. Maybe some kind of a disappropriation of media as well, where media pays interest, focusing on multinationals, focusing on corporations and what they do, rather than a lot of smaller cooperatives that have smaller number of people and they're just going on and doing their jobs. There's nothing interesting to report there. And so this is why it's also not reflected in the media. And then once it's not in the public attention, it kind of disappears completely. So this is probably another reason. But I think with the rise of new technologies, we are now going to move more and more into an area where we'll start talking more about cooperatives. In the business school, we are now teaching our students about cooperatives as an alternative form. And then hopefully this is going to take off in other areas.
Just before Josh jumps in, two quick points. One is the media are very interested in talking about cooperatives when there's a failure. And the Murray Goulburn was a perfect example of it. And it's about the dabbling in more of the corporate environment where they came pretty well unstuck. The second component, which is about that, I think as you've just said, in the parliamentary inquiry, which was last year, one of the major recommendations from the Senate inquiry into cooperatives was that there is a need for the professional associations to ensure that there is an understanding, and also that there needs to be a teaching, which simply has not been occurring. The example being, you can go all the way through in an accounting degree through to master's level and not get one semester, one unit on cooperatives, and a similar scenario in the legal profession.
When I think about the famous cooperatives that I've heard of, they're all decades of years old. They were all started many years ago, and then you might hear about some failing or whatnot. But when I think about the famous startups and tech companies I know about, they were all started recently. And I think there's something about this which is, one, people pay attention to new things more than they pay attention to old things. So anyone who's got an idea to change the world, and I think we can do this, they will more likely to look at something that was created recently to copy than something that was created decades ago. The other one, I think, is that starting things cooperatively is harder than starting things independently. So if you've got an idea for a startup and you want to get 20 people together and agree on how you're going to do that startup, you won't be able to move fast enough to survive. And I think this is where cooperatives are an excellent form for preserving value and preserving the ethics of an organisation once it's established and once it's viable. But I don't think they're a really good form for pioneering a new type of a new business, where a much smaller team and much more rapid iterations than a cooperative are more useful. And so a lot of the work we've been doing is experimenting with a form of how can you design an organisation where it's expected to evolve into a cooperatively owned enterprise where all of its surplus goes towards its social mission and not to external shareholders or founders. But you are still going to compensate shareholders and founders in some way for the work in the early days. So you take some of the dynamism from the startup world and then you transition to the ethical stability from the cooperative world is one of the sort of lines of inquiry that's been interesting us. And I think that that's probably enough.
Really interesting. Just a quick question. So we spoke about cooperatives in the media. Is there any value in changing the language around cooperatives to something else that might be more media friendly or friendlier to a millennial audience?
I think that when you ask, not that many young people know much about the history of cooperatives or are that interested in it. And if you go and say, do you want to start a startup or do you want to make a cooperative? They kind of just say, I just want to change the world. A huge number of young people are deeply aware of the challenges our civilization faces and are incredibly motivated to do something about it. So when you say, do you want to make money or do you want to make a difference? Most young people say, I want to make a difference. And I think it's just about demonstrating proven and realistic ways that here's a way that you can make a difference, and you will have hordes of people jumping through that.
I think that if you have a new name for a beautiful thing, usually what happens is that it will be hijacked. So it doesn't really matter much to propose a new name, because I know in advance that if it stands for something which is good by the masses, then it will be hijacked. On the other hand, if there is a name for something that is considered bad, then it usually loses the positive euphemism that it tried to. So I try to make. So for example, you all know, like in the past in America, you would say Negro, yeah? And then maybe nigger. And then, of course, it's politically incorrect. And then it was black. But black is also politically incorrect. And now it's African American. So, I mean, it will continue ad nauseum as long as society believes that there is something bad. I mean, society, I'm talking in general terms, that there is something bad about the referent that it stands for. Now, we have a Bulgarian Natalia here. The word, do you know the word bugger? Bugger, B-U-G-G-E-R, like
no.
bugger, poor bugger. So, like, apparently bugger, if you look at the etymology, it's a negative thing, but you see the etymology is totally forgotten, which is good, because the etymology, the real origin is in the 10th century. There was a sect of Bulgarians who moved from Sofia to Paris. And they were homosexuals. And one person said, look, there is a bulk there, there is a Bulgarian. But the other guy understood it as homosexual. And this is how bulk, which meant Bulgarian, adopted the new meaning homosexual. Now, after a while, it went to English as bugger and etc. But now, poor bugger, you just say, oh, shit, bugger. I mean, it doesn't really mean homosexual anymore. Sodomizer, it just means holy shit, Sorry that there are some kids here. So the point I'm trying to make is that, of course, it is politically acceptable to use bugger because no one sees anymore the link to Bulgarian, which is the real etymology. On the other hand, in America, if you say niggardly, as you know, means ungenerous or stingy. It has nothing to do with the word nigger, nothing. But of course, if you say niggardly and somebody listens to you, 11 days later, there was a guy in Washington. He had to resign because somebody alleged that he used a racial slur because he said, "Oh, look at this niggardly person." But the guy was not even black. He was just stingy. So the point of the matter is how the native speaker understands the concept that the term stands for. So if we change sharing economy to distributive economy, or then somebody like McDonald's, Walmart, somebody kind of with an agenda which is totally against the ethics, the business ethics, will hijack it and use it as a euphemism for a bad thing that they do. And this is when the term will be kind of destroyed.
Thanks, Ghil'ad. I want to get back to the idea of millennials and cooperatives. So, Jess, question for you. Is there something with millennials today that is stopping them from embracing cooperatives? Is there something in today's society that means that...
I'd suggest that this is the most collaborative generation ever. If you think about what the great media scoops or the media moments of the past 5 years have been, they have not been moments that were about a single brilliant mind. It's not the lone genius. They were the Panama Papers, in which hundreds of journalists at dozens of different publications around the world collaborated over the span of a number of years in order to process and then release information all on the same day. Likewise with the WikiLeaks scoop. If you look at the primary source of information for millennials, it would be something like Wikipedia, which is a totally collaborative media exercise. So I think there is no generation that's more primed for cooperative action. I do think there is a tension with the focus on the startup and the sole entrepreneur, but I think it is incumbent on people who are championing cooperatives to show how this business model can be tailored to and tooled to suit, again, this generation that is about impact and outcomes and that wants that above making money. So how do you turn the cooperative into a more readily useful tool for the kind of longevity that you're talking about, Josh, as well? That I think is but I don't think there's a generation more prepared for this.
Excellent.
So, I agree with you. I do feel that there is another tension, and this tension around competition versus cooperation. I have children in primary school, and with all the different tests and in focus on individual performance and everything else, I can see how from early on already we're teaching our kids that you have to succeed, you have to be competitive, you have to be the best. So this idea of competition is what driving us. Competition is what is the success behind the human race. It's taken over, same as neoliberalism, and it's completely displaced the cooperative spirit. And there's actually quite a lot of research now coming from sociologists, from psychologists, even from neuroscientists who are saying that human beings are inherently cooperative. We actually have survived through cooperation, not through competition. But yet, the way our institutions, the way our organizations are structured, the way all the practices around us, all the institutional practices around us are structured, they are based on the assumptions that we have to be competitive to be successful and to survive. And this could be one thing that is making millennials, but all of us, less open towards cooperative forms because they just are being raised with a different belief, what drives us.
I would like just to say about cooperation and competition, China would be a very interesting country to look at because the Chinese education, as you know, is one of the most competitive education on earth. So from a very early stage in your educational career, you learn how to kind of solve exams, which are obviously multiple choice rather than essays of thinking, etc. The best way, elimination, etc. Chinese are unbelievably good in such exams. But then it comes in a country which allegedly is communist. Now, the result is that you go to Shanghai and you see, I have two friends in Shanghai, I have many more. One of them gets $1,000 per annum. This is his salary. The other one, $1 million per annum. So 1,000 times. I have two friends. They're not independent. They work for a company. one gets 1,000, so 1 promille of the other. Now, I don't know anybody in Australia. I don't have 2 people who work for a company. I'm not talking about independent, like Trigoboff, or I'm talking about people who work for a normal company. I don't know anybody in Australia who earns 1,000, so 1,000 times more than another friend of mine. This I know in Shanghai.
Josh, I think you're curious.
I think that one of the reasons why this generation is so primed for cooperation is because of the technology.
Yeah.
That when you grow up expecting to have a means to talk back to someone or expecting to have a means to connect with people, you start to realize that you don't do things on your own, you do things with other people. And I think that the whole point about the dominant narrative of our society, the worldview of our society, has overemphasized competition significantly. And that's kind of, if you're into building societies, that's not a great thing. But if you're looking at when you start to look at what's the state of the planet and how can we effectively change things to make so we're not killing the place really effectively, it's not about changing any one individual, any group of people. We need to come up with a completely different system for organizing and conducting many of our affairs. And if that's the game we're playing, then this blind spot, this overemphasis on competition, is a massive asset for us, because it means that system, the whole system, is suboptimal. It is not as effective as it could be, because if you want to make a new system, if you want to make a new way of doing business, a new way of doing education, a new way of doing governance, you need to be not just the same, you need to be a whole lot better to actually displace it in a reasonable amount of time. And given that deep flaw, which is overemphasizing competition, if you design a new system which appropriately recognizes cooperation, because humans are competitive and we're cooperative, and if you have both sides of that in the system, that system actually has a shot of displacing some of the most established human organizing systems in our lifetime. And so I think that's one reason why cooperation is such an interesting topic.
Peter?
I think absolutely. The issue around competition, it's the millennials, me generation. What's good for me needs to be good for you and her and everyone. One of the issues, of course, though, is when you're in a startup environment, how do you get those resources to actually start to bring it together? The discussion around the labour market, of course, you are the resource. If it's but starting up a tech venture, there's money required in that. Josh, I know that you've got certainly a role in that sort of concept around pooling. Can you add to that?
Yeah, so I think that when you're particularly looking at the domain of how do you start a new business, then you basically need investment. You need investment of time and you need investment of money. The way that most startups are born these days are through accelerator programs or startup communities. Pretty much all of them are copied off the Silicon Valley model, which is investors say, we're going to make all of our returns off one business. If I invest in 100, 99 of them are going to be completely immaterial to my financial success. But if I back a Google, then I win. If I don't find a Google, I lose. So the investors are doing a quite aggressive search for the 1 in a million venture. But there are a whole bunch of ventures that don't have a chance of being a Google, which could still be a profitable venture if appropriately run. And so there's this other type of investing strategy emerging, which is, I'm going to invest in 20 companies. I don't care if I find a Google or not. I just want more of those companies to succeed than don't, and I want to get a return on that investment, which is much more modest than a 10-to-1 return sort of deal. And so that's an investment strategy which a lot of impact investors are starting to look at, about how do we just appropriately invest in profitable companies. And I think that that's one thing which is sort of emerging from the tech landscape, or from the sort of early stage impact investment scene. Another thing that I find that's really interesting for me in the investment world is this idea of what are appropriate returns. Because if you look at a publicly traded company, like take Ford, for example. Ford, when it first started up, I think it was something like $100,000 in like 1905 or whenever it was. $100,000 in those days was quite a bit of money, but that was the total capital that people invested in Ford. After 10 years, that made 500 return. So those investors got 500 times their money back within 10, 15 years. And that was as dividends, not as share repurchases. Those shares have been traded on the stock exchange ever since. And so if you think about the deal which society is doing with early stage businesses, it's basically saying, hey, you people, you put in money, you put in time, you take a massive chance. You might fail completely, but if you succeed, you're going to create something very valuable, such as cheap automobiles or iPhones or Facebook, has immense value to society as a whole. But what we're doing now is we're saying, when you create that value, we're going to give you a perpetual license to extract profits from that thing forever. And it might not be you, it might be your children, or it might be someone else, but it's a perpetual claim on the profits of those entities. And that's all of basically publicly traded shareholder capitalism, which means that we have an economic leak going from everyone to a few number of people who own and control these companies forever. And now I think that when you think about that deal, it is a fair, there's an element of it which is fair, which is if you create a company, if you put in your time and your money, you create something valuable that doesn't exist, you should get a return. And it shouldn't be a salary, maybe it's a few $1 million. It shouldn't be a few $100 million, but there's some return there which is above and beyond what someone would make out of a normal, steady job. And so if you do give that kind of return and then say, and that's enough, you don't get a return anymore. You've now got a fair return for the risk you took, and now the surplus from this enterprise now belongs to all of us. The surplus from this enterprise belongs to society as a whole, and your job is to have a robust governance system so it keeps doing that, so it keeps stewarding it effectively. And that's sort of the transition thing, which I think is interesting.
So actually that leads into the next thing I kind of want to talk about. So one of the difficulties with collaboration and with cooperatives is the ability to make decisions as a group. Has anyone had an experience with how technology is helping that, or any insights into how group decision making can be made easier?
So one of the, who's participated in consensus decision making? A couple of people? So consensus decision making, I think it's better called consent, is basically if there are 10 of us sitting around the table, then as long as none of us violently disagree to something, it's going to happen. It doesn't mean we all say, yes, it's the right thing to do. We just say, I'm not going to block it. And so this is, I think it was the Quakers who did this a huge amount in the 1800s. It informed the cooperative movement a lot. It informed a lot of the women's liberation movement. It informed a lot of the activist movements. So it's a way of making decisions. And it's got good things and it's got bad things about it. One of the good things is that you basically front load decisions so that the hard conversations happen before the decision before the decision goes ahead. If 3 of us sit here and make a decision which affects all of us, and we just make a decision and say, hey, everyone, we're going to do this, or maybe come and tell us your ideas, and then we're going to tell you what we're going to do, then if you don't agree with it, you're going to resist that decision. You're not going to get behind it fully. There's going to be friction in the implementation. If we involve all of you in making that decision, it's going to be more expensive to make the decision, but we're all going to have more buy-in into it, and we're all going to execute that decision more effectively. So that's some of the fundamental trade-offs, but trying to get all of us into a room, like even arranging the meeting time would kill us. Let alone, hey, can everyone speak? Or if someone talks too much and dominates the conversation, how do you deal with that? If someone's shy and doesn't speak in public, how can their voice be heard? So there's lots of things where it's just the technology of our communications which limits the appropriateness of consent-based decision-making. So one of the ventures at Enspiral called Lumio had the idea of, hey, if you take that online, maybe you can do the same fundamental type of decision, but differently, because now you can be on your phone or on your computer, or you don't have to have a meeting time. And that, it's definitely not perfect, but it's just one example of how you can take something which kind of worked in certain situations and see if it worked in different ones fundamentally because of new technology.
There's also another good technological tool called Compendium. This is a free software, so available for free. It was developed, maybe about 10 years ago by Professor Simon Buckingham-Shum, who is now at UTS, but back then was still in London. And I recently attended a workshop where they demonstrated how it can be used for collective decision-making. And it's a software tool that you can map how the conversations are going and it follows specific tools. It actually works quite amazingly, and they have developed a lot of supporting resources. This is something that you will have to come together, but it actually, if it's facilitated by someone who has learned to use the tool well, it can lead to much, much more supported decisions where, again, not everybody agrees, but everybody agrees with the process that was followed to get to a decision. So, as I said, it's a free tool that's available. There are quite a few different versions, I think, flowing around. It's called Compendium.
I think one of the things that's a challenge, yes, you can have a platform that makes it easier for you to reach a consensus decision, But in order to have informed consent or informed consensus, you have to have information. And that's one of the things that's still difficult to get across in a way that ensures that everybody who's making the decision has the same access to information, understanding of that information. And there are a whole bunch of projects like the New Democracy Foundation, for example, is a project where they're trying to get more sort of citizen juries and participatory budgeting and all of that sort of stuff happening. But it is a really labour-intensive process because what you've got to do is you've got to find a representative group for the community that you want to make a decision. You've got to spend a lot of time with them to actually ensure that they're informed when they make that decision. And then you've got to give them tools to make sure that the loudest person doesn't get all the airtime and make sure that people with different points of view and people with unpopular points of view get the opportunity to have airtime as well, but you're not artificially distorting things like we see with the climate debate, for example, where you got to have the person who is going to be against the 99% of scientists or whatever. So that's one of the challenges that still remains.
Yeah. So we've spoken a lot about it, about collaborative decision-making and cooperatives in a business context. But can this be used on a kind of a higher governance council kind of area? Has anyone seen any good examples of that?
So I think that if you're interested in the future of government and governance, then there are lots of places working on it, but one of the hotspots to watch is Taiwan. That at the GovZero project, they were basically, if you think about the Occupy movement that we sort of saw around the US and a little bit over here, that imagine if they won and started electing the government. And that's what happened in Taiwan. That they occupied the government building, but then they started to elect people. And out of I think it was 9 mayors in Taiwan, 8 of them are independent, no party affiliation.
Wow.
And one of the tools that they used was called Polis, POL.is, so pol.is. And essentially, if you imagine we're having a conversation about how do we regulate Uber in New Zealand or in Sydney, and so this is something that they did. And then you start to have people putting up statements saying, I think that Ubers are okay so long as they don't undercut regular taxis. Or I think that Ubers are not okay if and so on. So anyone in the group can put up a statement. Everyone in the group gets exposed to the statements that are done, and they can say, do they agree with it or do they not? And what you can do with this is you can start to cluster individuals in the group based off the statements they agree with and the ones they disagree with. And this can start to help you visualize the factions in the community on what their positions are and what do they all agree on and what do they really disagree on. And who are the people who disagree on the similar things together? It's a really fascinating tool. So pol.is is one tool to watch.
Another good example is Barcelona, where the council is working quite heavily with the citizens to come up with decisions about the future of the city. So there's a lot of material on this that's freely available online. But if you're interested in looking into such models, so there will be another one to look into.
I'm on a council now, which is a really interesting new life that I've had since September. And
What council is that again?
It's the City of Sydney. It's a great council. I'm really fortunate because we've been really progressive for the past 12 years. We are an independent council. We have a majority of independent councillors. So we're not tied to either of the political parties. We have a really progressive agenda when it comes to fighting climate change and supporting culture and the knowledge economy. So it's wonderful, but it's still hard. I mean, one of the problems is that people have great and altruistic points of view until it becomes incredibly personal, until it becomes your car space that you're losing to the cycleway, for example. So that's where the things become really complicated, is where you go from having a set of abstract principles or abstract goods to tangible losses that you might have or sacrifices that you might have to make. And that process of negotiation, it seems to me after the past 9 months, is actually what local government is. It's that process of being an intermediary and balancing different interests at different times. And it'd be great to have tools that helped make that more visible, but in a more place-based way. So you could have a conversation about your street or your cycleway or your train station, or, how do you bridge the gap between the hyper-local and the digital world as well? I think that's the next step.
Really interesting.
I just want to say about Taiwan that we in Australia, just like in Taiwan, have 24 million people. So we have the same population size. We have 13 indigenous people who still speak their language. This is the same as Taiwan. Unfortunately, we in Australia killed 96% of the languages. So we have, although Taiwan is a very small island, there is a lot of similarity between Taiwan and Australia. So maybe we will follow suit, after Taiwan. And if I mention Aboriginal people, I think that it is yet to be studied, as far as I know, how we as Aussies can learn from the sharing that happens in Aboriginal Australia. As you know, Aboriginal people are very good at sharing. They might not be good at the decisions online, because in Aboriginal culture, there is no dyadic communication like here. For example, Claire asks me a question, I must respond. If I don't respond, you might think I'm Asperger's or something like that, or there is some problem. But in Aboriginal culture, if you ask, in the traditional one, if you ask an Aboriginal person, he doesn't need to reply. There is no dyadic communication style. So, for example, for an online conversation, it might not be good, the traditional one. This is just a kind of brainstorming right now. But when it comes to sharing, Aboriginal people are, very good at it. Very, very good at it.
So we've been discussing today whether the phrase "the sharing economy" has been hijacked, and I think if it's on a McDonald's billboard, it probably has. What does everyone think it should be called, or what we should be discussing this idea as? I'll start at the end with Peter. Sorry.
Good question. I'm not proposing that. I think that the issue is, it is about a degree of ownership of language. Josh mentioned before, earlier, that we came up with social enterprise, and everyone has a social enterprise. And it's now become the terminology for not-for-profits, as opposed to, because any not-for-profit is, of course, socially trading. Which is a misnomer. And I've been involved in social enterprise since 2000 when I worked for Uniting Care Wesley in Adelaide. And we undertook trying to create some definitions in that, and includes cooperatives, and include mutuals, and included charity trading organisations and that sort of stuff. But it didn't, interestingly, include individuals, of which, of course, now the social entrepreneur who invests in it, and then is doing good things, and a portion is being hijacked away for another for that social good. That's a whole layer that just didn't exist. So I haven't got a great terminology. It's the question to me about how we do utilise the vehicles, and particularly in the context of our creative and innovative industries.
Whenever I hear the term sustainability or transformation at the university in Australia, I know that there is going to be a huge making people redundant. So it's kind of a code for kind of firing 50 people. So sustainability, especially sustainable transformation. I don't know if you are at the university, but at the University of Adelaide, whenever there is either sustainable or transformation, you know that this actually stands for something which is much less benign. And I think that this kind of takes from the British tradition. I don't know how many British people there are here, but as you know, in Britain, double language is a very inherent part of language. And if I come back to China, I used to teach at Cambridge, England, Chinese academics who did not understand the language, although they studied according to the exams, what it means, for example, governor, what it means ambitious, what it means courageous, what it means bold. So, for example, when you have a bold proposal, so they thought, the supervisor believes that what I say is very courageous and very, very good, But actually, as you know, in the double language of England, if somebody says you have a bold proposal, this means what you're saying is palpable poppycock or bullshit. So, or if somebody says, I'm so happy to see you, I thought you were supposed to be in Australia, this means practically the F off. So I learned as a linguist and as a person sensitive to language that the hijacking, the euphemization, the obfuscation, the appropriation, the prostitution, the substitution, and any type of kind of the institutionalization will kind of follow up. So as I said earlier, I'm very cautious about recommending new names that I know will be hijacked if the concept that they stand for is a positive concept which is good for the well-being of the hoi polloi.
I'm always fascinated by it when you say it's a bold move. You have to remember Yes Minister, where he goes, it's a bold move, Minister.
Right. Exactly.
I think that in terms of language, I'm very pragmatic. I think that use it if it works and don't use it if it doesn't work. And that we should be quite cautious about which words are we just going to cut and say, they're just gone. Social enterprise, sharing economy, for me, not interested in trying to save them. But what words should we try and fight to save? And for me, the word I choose would be business. And I think that fundamentally, like instead of social enterprise, I think we just have enterprise and anti-social enterprise. And likewise, I think it's that there's really just business and then there's extractive business. So I think that if there is a business, like, and a lot of it has to do with scale. Like if there's a business with more than 10 people in it that is not capped in terms of the investments it will give, the return it will give its shareholders, the return it will give its founders or its investors, then it is by definition an extractive business. It will forever take money from the economy. And so anything at a certain size should be capped or it's an extractive business. So then I'll just say, and then what you're left with is just business.
And you had a lovely term, Josh, which was generative economy, didn't you?
Yep, so generative, I've heard people call it the generative economy. I've heard the idea of capitalism 2.0. But for me, I think that's great. But just like a colleague was saying, that it's essentially that if you don't change the soul of the wider community and what they mean by that, it will just keep recycling over. And I think what we need to do is fight for the soul of business.
So in a sense, if we can appropriate back the term business to mean something else to what it means at the moment, so to be a generative business rather than extractive. So we have to use the same principles, but the other way around. I would like to mention just one term that I think is also aligned with the sharing economy. It's a term called stewardship. Stewardship. It's about looking after something, could be a business, could be a venture, or it used to be back when the term developed, used to be the kingdom while the king was away at war, but looking after something in the interest of other people. And it's really about other orientation rather than self-orientation. So it's based on the principle of cooperation and the principle of being responsible and accountable and sharing rather than being opportunistic and self-interested. And this term is starting to pick up in the business community, in the business press as well. So that might be one to look for in the future.
For me, what these business models or organisational models do is formalise collaboration. And collaboration is one of the terms I think that's been used and abused the most in recent years, and we all strive to be collaborative, but we don't often have practical ways to do that for a long term. We can do it for a project, you can do it for a film, but how do you do it over the long term? And how do you pass it on from one generation to the next? How do you pass it on when certain personalities might leave the mix that might be holding things together in terms of the human dynamics? So to me, it is about formalising collaboration for the long term.
Especially when it's not something that we're being taught. As Natalia said earlier, we're kind of being taught to be competitive. So look, I'm going to throw it out. We've got some time from questions from the audience, and I'm keen to hear what everyone else thinks it maybe should be called. Is there a term that you've heard that really sums up these ideas that you think is valuable?
I belong...
What's your name?
Peter Butler.
Another one.
Peters are good.
They indeed, they're the rocks.
I belong to a cooperative network called the Greater Western Sydney Cooperative Network. It's in formation. We're trying to, establish this in this region of Western Sydney because we see potential here. Just a couple of points. I've found this whole discussion fascinating.
The long term,
One thing
you can
is
do it for a
about
project,
the
you make it, do it for a
existing
film, but how do you do it,
legislation. It
over
is
the long
very,
term?
very hard for
And how do you
co-ops
pass
to
it on
get
from one
through
generation to the
that
next? How do you pass
process.
it on
And,
when, certain
they
personalities
keep
might leave the
throwing you
mix
back,
that
saying
might
you
be
have
holding
to
things together
modify
in terms
this
of the
and you
human
do
dynamics.
that, and then they
So
find
to me,
something
it is
else.
about formalising
So,
collaboration
the
for the long
system
term.
is not
Especially when
very
it's not something that we're
amenable
being taught,
to this
as Natalia
field.
said earlier, we're kind of being
But
taught to be
despite that, we're
So
going to
look, I'm going
persevere.
to throw it out.
But
We've
there's a
got some
couple of
time for
interesting
questions from the
things
audience.
that
But I'm keen to
have
hear
come
what everyone else
have
thinks
come
it
out
maybe
of this.
should be heard. Is
One
there a
is
term that you've
the
heard
link
that really
with,
sums up
with new
these ideas?
technology. Basically, what I'm feeling is that in society there is a mood for a different approach. It's just how we get that moving, Now, under the surface of mainstream media and so on, I think there's a lot more going on. For example, one of the members of our network is Professor Anthony Jensen. He used to teach at the business school at Sydney. He is now transferred to the University of Newcastle and teaching a course there on co-ops. So things like that indicate to me that there will be a growing awareness, as those students go through and move into professions themselves and so on. There is the potential for a growing awareness of this field. The other particular thing I want to mention is a movement that some of you probably know a lot about, and that is the so-called new economy. So again, under the surface, there's a lot of investigation about how can we do business differently to get away from the dominant capitalist model. So basically, even though there may not appear to be very much happening on the surface, I think for a whole lot of reasons, technological, and also the mood, people are fed up with dominant capitalism, and people are more interested in focusing on collaboration and cooperation and so on. It might be called different things, but I do believe there's a potential for that whole approach to grow, and I believe it will, as some of these people who are coming through these courses and different approaches get on board and drive that change.
Great, thank you. And there's a new economy conference happening in Brisbane on the 1st to 3rd of September, if anyone's interested. Over here.
Hello, thank you very much, panel. My name's Irene. I'm from a company called Magic Electricity Box, and we're based in regional New South Wales. And I guess my question is really about what are some of the interesting ways that technology has enabled trust. We work a lot with Aboriginal communities, and we do a lot of our work face-to-face and invest in that collaborative decision-making process and the consensus process. And what I'm interested in discovering, I guess, is what type of platforms are embracing trust, what kind of thought leadership is going into trust, and what kind of research and academia is going into that whole trust in the business space.
Who's going to take this one?
All of you should.
I think we are shifting. One of the biggest things that's about to happen is the shift with the blockchain to distributed trust and to decentralised organisational model. So I think there is a fundamental technological shift that is about to happen, powered by that particular technology. But because we are still human, and I think culture trumps technology in that how we relate to each other and the nature of our power dynamics and relationships and how we negotiate those things is much harder to change and more important to change than merely the technology. So I think we already have the tools for distributed decision making. I think more of those tools are coming, but the culture has to lead.
I think that's a massive question, and that we're starting to skim the surface of what trust looks like in the system. In one way, you can see the examples of I don't trust an individual, I trust their Airbnb ratings, that I'll let them into my house. And so we're displacing trust from individuals to a number in a computer system. And on the other hand, I've seen because all of Enspiral is built upon a small group of high trust people. Because when you have people who trust each other a lot, you can have fundamentally different rules of the game in economics. And so, and technology has enabled us to build that by spending time together. So the way we've built trust is by not using technology, it's by sitting in circles and having retreats and helping people know each other. Because a lot of that kind of trust is not about, I trust you to do what you say you're going to do, I trust you to act like I've seen you act before. So just by knowing someone a lot and spending time with them, often we can sort of have a different kind of trust, which is like, yeah, I'm not going to give you the keys to my car, but I will have a lot of respect for you, kind of thing.
I think, one of the issues around startups and cooperatives, I think picking up from where Josh mentioned earlier, the scenario of actually a startup venture is very hard as a cooperative. It might work pretty well in the context of, say, housing cooperatives, but when we're dealing with real market-based activity, it does take quite some time. And in fact, colleagues in the Mercury Group, we've coined the phrase the 50 beers principle, in that, if you want to create a shelf company, you can do it overnight and just, pull it off the shelf and away you go. You can set it up tomorrow. If you want to start an incorporated association, get a few people together and, you can do it in a week. But if you want to form a cooperative, you've really got to have a minimum of 5 people. They've got to agree to a common bond or a common relationship. And so if you can follow the several meetings, there's at least 5 of them you can follow. You need a couple of beers every time you're doing it. So the minimum 50 beers principle. So I think that point about trust is about how you actually do come together and have that conversation. And I do think that there's also this scenario around steps. But maybe that step process is not part of the current legislation, and there is need for flexibility in that in a contemporary context, and how you move that forward.
I would like to answer just the Aboriginal part of your question. I'm pessimistic with regard to building trust with Aboriginal communities in Australia over the internet. I think that it has to do with intergenerational PTSD, which will last for at least several generations. So we are talking about people who themselves were not linguicided, meaning they were not kind of taken the language out of them, or they were not massacred, but still because they remember their grandparents, etc. So this will happen. I mean, it will not happen in our lifetime, unfortunately. However, if you are a genius and you do manage to find some trustworthy online ways, in the case of Aboriginal people specifically, I would argue that you must you make use of 3 components. One is narration, a little bit like narrative psychotherapy, Dalish Center in Adelaide. So narration or narrative is very, very important in Aboriginal culture. The other one is spirituality, which in my own case would be 0. I mean, I wouldn't care about it, but in Aboriginal culture, absolutely, it's part of it. And the last thing maybe would be art and mental health together. Art is very, very important. So whatever you do, in order to build this trust, you will need to touch upon these 3 or 4 components that maybe you won't need when you deal with other communities in Australia.
Sorry, just a very short note to your question whether there's academic research on trust. There is a huge body of literature on trust. It's always been studied. However, trust has always been appropriated by the same economic discourse, and it's been presented as a contract. If you trust me, I trust you, you trust me, but we're having actually a contract. I'm not going to go into the details of research, but I just want to point out one little thing that many people don't know. The father of modern capitalism, Adam Smith, actually in his second book that many people don't know, called Theory of Moral Sentiments, has told that it's not just self-interest, because people say that it was he who said it's all about self-interest in capitalism. He's actually said it's self-interested, but it's actually that self-interest has to be combined and has to be balanced with benevolence, which means looking after others. But this piece of work that Adam Smith has written in his second most influential book has been forgotten for many, many years, and it's not being taught properly in many universities because people focus on the wealth of nation, which is the competitive piece, but then don't focus on his theory of moral sentiments, which is, again, very sad.
Very sad. I think there was a question over here.
Thank you. It's been a very interesting discussion. My name's Monique. I'm from the University of Technology, Sydney. I had a question for the panel about the role of gender in these changes in business practice and, I guess, distributed models of governance. And if anyone had any thoughts about what the role of gender is and how that might be changing.
It's a big one.
And we thought trust was a big topic. I think the main thing would just be saying that everyone in this room and everyone in society has been moulded by the information they've been given since they were a child to incorrectly perceive gender. And it's demonstrable. There are great studies. Go to like Harvard's Implicit Project, and you can see the deep, incorrect stereotypes we will all carry, despite our conscious beliefs, about gender and race and whatnot. So I would just say gender is a massive societal wound which we need to actively reconfigure our unconscious assumptions about before we can engage with it realistically.
I would like to add, in languages where the word bridge, for example, is feminine, you know that in some languages you have gender as in grammatical gender. So feminine, masculine, sometimes neutral. In languages where the word bridge is feminine, when you ask people to describe a bridge, any bridge, they would tend to describe it as solid, as sturdy. In languages where the word for bridge is feminine, they would tend to describe a bridge, any bridge, as elegant, as beautiful, and this is subconscious. So absolutely gender plays a role in language. I just noticed that unlike the bill, I think the bill about the abortion, when Trump showed the photo, there were only men in the room. Do you remember that photo? It was like 20 men. I mean, here we have three girls there and 3 boys here. It was kind of very... so I think that it's... And also, if you look around, it's, well, I guess a little bit maybe more girls and boys. But, you know, we are very attentive to that.
Just a small note that the discourse of competition goes hand in hand with masculinity. So the discourse around cooperation, which is connected to nurturing, is then connected to that more feminine part of the, I guess, of our personalities. So I think with our focus back to cooperation, collaboration, we also have an opportunity to bring back more feminine discourse to make it more significant again. Again, a huge topic, so this is just really scratching the surface of that.
Well named.
Does anyone else have a ridiculously big question? Over here.
Hello, everyone. I don't have a question, just a comment. My name is Olivera Marjanovic. I'm director of the Cooperative Research Group at the University of Sydney. And I'm surrounded by many of our students here, Sydney University students. So people are learning about cooperatives and getting a new understanding about what it is that we can do together. And I just wanted to offer a comment about how difficult it is to start cooperatives. And maybe it's too easy to start small businesses, I would argue, because we know in Australia, most small businesses fail within the first 2 years. And the fact that it's actually a bit harder to start up something that is a cooperative as a legal entity will make people think a little bit harder in terms of value proposition. And I'm not saying business value creation, but value proposition. And will force people to think a little bit more about what it is that they have as a longer term vision, because it's not one person, it's actually a minimum of 5. And we do have some tremendous resources that, for the benefit of this audience, just in case they haven't heard, about Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals. They have fantastic resources to help people to understand, first of all, what cooperatives are, and then how to go about starting up a cooperative business. We have New South Wales Foundation of Cooperatives with excellent, easy to read and easy to follow resources about legislative systems and about everything else that somebody who may be interested in cooperatives could learn from. The best thing is that we have a wealth of people, and I'm speaking on behalf of others because our research group does not really provide any resources of that kind. We hope to provide research as well as education, but Peter has a fantastic website where people can go and have a look. Another Peter also has a wealth of expertise, this Peter as well. So one of the best things about this community is that when you are starting a startup, for example, and you have your competitor mindset, you are against everybody else. And you may not even think about it, but this is what people aspire to do. When you are starting a cooperative, one of the best aspects of this community, you may find another cooperative who is similar and actually go and ask people, how did you go about this? Because cooperation is one of the ICA principles of the cooperative movement. And you have plenty of other people around you to ask questions, to connect with, to learn from, and to count on their support when times are tough. So I know about the Enspiral, and I would like to invite Josh to tell us a little bit more, please, because I wouldn't miss this opportunity for my students not to hear about a fantastic example that you are running. So please tell us a little bit more about Enspiral.
Okay. Fundamentally, it started out wanting to basically, how can I spend the hours of my life trying to make the best difference I can in the world? And this is what I see a lot of people doing, is that they have a lot of opportunities in front of them and they choose the ones which they feel will be of the most service to the greatest need. And so I started to do a little bit of contract work, and then I did a lot of volunteering. So I did climate change volunteering, youth leadership, environmental ideas. And then I did that for a couple of years, and and this is where I really saw firsthand how many people deeply care about this and want to do things. And I was a programmer, so I could earn quite a bit of money quite quickly. And so I basically said the core idea of Enspiral is to help people who want to change the world get high-paid contract work so they can be self-funded change makers and pursue whatever they want to. And that sort of got a bunch of us in to become this freelancers cooperative. The Clay Shirky was hugely instrumental in thinking. So here comes everybody, and the idea that the technology that's emerging can completely reshape and reframe the way organizations can work and the way society can work. That it's starting to create a new system to work in. And this idea then of self-management became another big theme, which ended up transitioning from becoming a cooperative of contractors to becoming a cooperative of entrepreneurs and businesses. And that was a journey over 4 or 5 years, and we learned a whole bunch of stuff along the way. Our main theory of change is open source anything we've learned so other people can copy it. Find other cooperatives around the world who are interested in professional services cooperatives or entrepreneurial cooperatives. And the sort of edge of the learning at the moment is, what's the future of franchising going to look like? Because if somewhere, someone in Sydney or in Perth or wherever finds a new business which has actually got an edge and it's got a place in the market, and instead of saying we're going to raise lots of VC money and scale this globally, they say we'd like to open source this business, and we would like to have the founders and investors receive a modest payout, but then the essence of the business goes into the commons, which lots of other businesses can then use and collectively govern that commons. That will, one, create a whole bunch of impactful businesses, but it will also provide an opportunity for us to solve some really interesting governance problems, which might be quite useful. So that's the edge of the learning at the moment, and that's, I guess, Enspiral in 2 minutes. More than happy to talk a lot more about it later.
I think we will all be waiting to hear how you go with that. Sounds absolutely fascinating. Look, guys, unfortunately, we've run out of time. So I just want to say a massive thank you to our great panel. What an interesting discussion today. Thank you.